Welcome to the Revolution of Being podcast. Here we get raw, deep, real, and discuss all things high-level spirituality, healing, money, and business. Together, we're going to be interviewing industry experts and bringing you wisdom and insights from our personal journeys and others with whom you can learn from. Collapse time as you evolve and enjoy the ride. Hi there. We are jumping right in with a topic that is so near and dear to our heart, and that is the topic of triggers.
Yeah. Talk about trigger warnings, huh?
They get the ultimate trigger warning as we dive in. And so, one of the pillars, I think, of a growth process, of really spirituality, of self-actualizing, is that inward reflection. And one of the biggest ways that we experience life and kind of take in information around us, the perfect reflection is in how we are triggered and the way that we are interpreting the world around us. So, Jess, do you want to dive into a little bit about how you've experienced triggers, or rather, like some of the science behind why we're triggered?
Yeah. So triggers are so interesting, aren't they? And you know what? I think most of us probably just walk around life getting triggered and we have no idea. Or maybe we have some idea, but triggers direct us all day long, right? We watch the news, we get triggered about something, we have new feelings throughout the day. We're at work, we get triggered by something. The rest of our day is determined by that trigger. We think these are just independent thoughts, but they're really just triggering something deeper. And so when we talk about triggers, I think more importantly, we want to talk about what is that from a scientific standpoint. And now you do hypnotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
So you're getting deep into people's subconscious
Mm-hmm.
and you're really kind of digging into what are those triggers that we might not even be aware of. Like
Right.
what's happening so far below the surface. We can talk about all the obvious stuff, but I think from a scientific standpoint, you're going to really know that information. So from where you sit as a hypnotherapist,
Mhm.
what is a trigger?
Yes. So, as you mentioned, so on the surface, right, what we recognize as triggers are you say something, I feel offended, my blood pressure raises, I get prepared for fight and flight, right? So that is the surface level. Or your favorite sports team lost, and that like ruins your whole week. That's a trigger. And so what we're actually diving into is really the subconscious mind. So essentially all of us are walking around like 5-year-olds in big people bodies. And so our subconscious minds are that's what's running the show, right? So 95% of our day is subconsciously directed, meaning the habits we wake up with, how you run your mornings, probably weekdays, maybe weekends, are very, very similar. You just automatically have these things that you do, and including our thoughts, our feelings, our values, our political affiliations, our, religious backgrounds. All of that is subconscious. Those are programs that we had when we were little that were placed in us, whether we receive them, with intention or kind of as a side conversation that we absorbed.
Can I
And
pause you?
yeah.
1 minute. I'm not going to stop your flow, but
Mhm.
let's just talk about 1 second.
Mhm.
All those programs,
Yes.
we run them because it's more efficient,
Yes.
right? So when people are hearing this, it can be triggering. It's like, well, that's just what I do during the day. Yes, it is. If we had to be consciously thinking constantly, we would be exhausted. So I just wanted to intervene for 1 second and say it's like our energy star.
Totally.
Um,
And
efficient.
you hit the nail on the head. It's a survival mechanism. We learn how to do something and then we just know how to do it, right? We don't want to have to learn how to ride a bike or drive a car every time we do that. So our brain is so brilliant, it automates all these processes. However, it doesn't have the discernment to automate things that don't necessarily serve us. And so this comes down to how is a subconscious programmed? So before the age of 8, we are like these little sponges that just absorb information because we don't have what's called the critical faculty, um, which is kind of like this little screen that, as we get older, allows us to take in information or disregard it, meaning like that doesn't resonate, no thank you. The sky is in fact not purple, it's blue usually. So we can discern as we get older. And so a great example, and sorry, earmuffs if little kids are around, but how, for a lot of us, we fully believed Santa existed, that it was very possible this jolly man made his way around the whole world in a single night, right? That was because we didn't have the discernment to be like, that's not realistic or reasonable. And so we are programmed, the bulk of it's when we're little. But what happens is we're just receiving information, information, information. And that can come by authority figures. So the doctor saying something to us, that can come through our parents, the way they say things to us, like, oh my gosh, you are so much smarter than your brother, or why can't you do this like your sister? And you kind of take in these ways about the world. You begin to interpret the world through the things you're told. The other way we can be programmed as well is through a traumatic experience. And that can really happen at any point in your life as well, right? You get in a car accident, suddenly the brain associates, again, survival mechanism, that it's unsafe to drive because this car accident happened. So there's an immediate connection made in the brain. This is not safe. And so that impacts and affects every single way we show up. If we lack confidence, that's likely something that happened when we were younger, or something was said by our peers who are also highly influential. A lot of our beliefs about money, right? Money is a huge thing for people, are based on how we grew up, right? So why is it that people that are very wealthy tend to have kids who are also very wealthy? It's not because they're necessarily inheriting money, but it's because they grew up with the belief that money's easy to make. Money just is, it's effortless, it's inevitable. Whereas someone who grew up, more in my experience, where it was a very scarce environment, money was a very challenging thing for me. Like, I didn't think it was possible to live in a nice home. I didn't think it was possible to not have debt. So there's so many ways that we're programmed. And so, part of what we begin to do when we evaluate triggers is those are the little cues to what's happening in our subconscious mind. So in a hypnosis process, we're bypassing the conscious mind and getting to the subconscious to understand what happened that made that belief, right? Because you have this experience, which once it's charged with an emotion, creates a belief because the brain says, I need to remember this because it's survival. And our biggest things to survival include wanting to be a part of a community. So we have this herd mentality of wanting to fit in. So if anything that we experience makes us not fit in, we have to kind of recalibrate our brain to figure out what can I do to be a part of that crowd, right? Like, my family has these beliefs. They are this, political affiliation. I need to have that too, because if I don't, I'm not going to survive. And although as rational adults, we can be like, well, that's not reasonable. Like, of course, you're not going to like die if you don't have the same beliefs as I. But when you're a child and you don't have that discernment, it gets imprinted in your brain. And so as we get older, the way we can start to get hints about what's in those programmings, kind of the surface level, like what's erupting forth, is really the triggers. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of the science behind that. Did that kind of answer that in a helpful?
Yeah, no, that was really good. I think I love Joe Dispenza, and he talks about this, and the one thing he says over and over is we bring the unconscious conscious,
Mhm.
because triggers in and of themselves, like if we just get super layman about it, it's not just a way we think, right? We don't just get to go, I'm not going to think that way. There is
Mhm.
a physiological response. It creates cognitive dissonance, just
Mhm.
like what you said, right? As rational adults, we can sit here and say, well, that's not reasonable. But that little wounded inner child that is triggered just grabbed the car steering wheel and they're driving that car.
Yep.
And we are in this fight between what's rational and what this child is trying to survive. So I think it's really important for our audience to know this is not a shame game.
Mhm.
This is real, and it's something that I think every human being in different ways deals with, either
Mhm.
because, we grew up with maybe a lot of trauma that's triggered things, or we grew up in a healthy household but still, we had the impact of other people's thoughts and opinions. None
Yes,
of us really get to escape this unscathed. So,
correct. And I want to say too, because I had this conversation recently with a good friend who's a very respected doctor. And we were talking about triggers and trauma. And he's like, well, I don't have any trauma. We all do. Like, well,
Mhm.
my family was great. That doesn't matter. Like, cool. I'm glad. I'm so grateful that you had a beautiful upbringing. You're still not escaping this game of life without trauma because, right, it may not have been from your family directly, but it could have been the school kids in the playground the playground that were bullying you. Or you had a good family and they were all doctors. So the unconscious belief is I have to be a doctor too to fit in. And that's my suspicion with a lot of people who, it's like, well, look a little bit deeper because we are all influenced by our environment. And even, I tell people like be really careful because even though we're not a 5-year-old child anymore, we're still being influenced constantly. There's been some interesting experiences, or rather, documentaries talking about how, anything can be used to influence you. Social media, the news, these are all hypnotic. You get into kind of a flow state, essentially. It's a hypnotic state, it's a focused state of awareness. And when you're in that focused state of awareness, you are highly influential. So you might be like, no, it can't influence me. We all are all the time.
Yes.
So the first thing I tell my clients if they have anxiety or any kind of struggle with fear is turn the news off. Like turn the news off. Don't be feeding that beautiful unconscious brain any information that's not supporting you and feeling really, really good. Because through confirmation bias, we're constantly looking for things that validate our beliefs and our feelings. And then we go blind to everything else around us that contradicts that. Again, survival. So, as you said, not a shame game. This isn't about making anybody right or wrong. In fact, one of the um, principal values of neurolinguistic programming, for those who are familiar, it's a subconscious modality. One of the principal values is that all of us are right within our own frame of reference because we are all coming with vastly different perspectives. So your beliefs are completely valid. Mine are probably different, and they're equally valid because we have very different lived experiences that completely impact how we show up.
Yeah. And the example I use with my clients the most, because when you're first learning this stuff, it feels like woo, right? But if you've ever been shopping for a car and you're looking to buy this red sedan, right? Have you ever been there? Like you're
Oh,
going to
yeah.
buy this new thing
Uh-huh.
and you find it and you just become so emotionally invested in the decision you're making. Suddenly, it's the vehicle you see everywhere. And you maybe didn't see it before, but you are literally tuned in
Mhm.
to that. So, this happens with our triggers too,
Mhm.
right? We become very tunnel visioned. And so, if whatever it is triggering us is very much emotionally pulling us, suddenly we're seeing it everywhere. And guess what? We're
Mhm.
just living in a perpetual state of being triggered. The news, everything, we are gravitating towards it and it's moving towards us.
Yes.
So anyways, I think that hopefully answers the question for people listening, because my personal belief is that we don't get to change something we're not aware of.
Mhm.
And our triggers really do teach us. They teach us where to look within ourselves. And it is a layered situation.
Mhm.
As we know, we start here, and year after year, the layers get more challenging,
Mhm.
right? And you and I talk all the time. I mean, this is part of why we're doing this. We talk all the time about these layers and how much more challenging some of this stuff is. And it's because we're getting down to closer to that core of who we are. There are things that we might have been able to kind of bypass,
Mhm.
or and now they're coming up and they're
Yes.
just gut punching us,
Yes.
having to look at it. There's no way around it. We don't get to turn it off. And I think that the world is probably facing that. What I see around me is a lot of this stuff.
Completely. And there's this drive, I think a lot of people are realizing the way they show up is not serving them, right? They know something is going on, but they don't yet know how to change it, right? And I'd love to kind of dive into some of our personal examples for a little context, right? because you and I have been in the personal development field for a long time and being very intentional. I mean, for years on our own work. And I think, I'd be happy to start with an example when I was first learning this, right? Like when I was first learning this, my first experience years ago, it was during COVID. Was I hired a coach and because I knew I'm like my life, I've done therapy, I've done all the nutritional stuff, I've done all the healthy crap, and I'm still struggling with crippling anxiety. Like, what am I missing? And this person, and he was a neurolinguistic programming coach and hypnotist. And so what had happened was he was calling me on my bullshit. Like he was calling me out. I was the number one victim in my story. And when that was challenged, my default mode was to shut down and go into victimhood. And he knew how to punch those triggers to really erupt them to the surface. And it's genius. I mean, it was exactly what I needed because I was ready for it, right? Now, to the average person, they're probably going to check out at that point, right? Like they're going to be like, F you, F this, you're wrong, you don't know my story. But I had a little voice in me that was like, just be curious. Like, just be with this, right? I had cried, I was pissed. And fortunately, this person had recordings of their coaching calls. And so I reviewed the coaching call. And when I looked back at it with more of a lens of neutrality, I was like, oh my God. Like,
Isn't it
oh my,
horrifying?
and I
Reality is not what we see all the time.
no, and I recognized what he said, what I interpreted were very different. And my default mode was to shut down. That was how it was, that fight, flight, freeze. And I would shut down. And then, one of the things this person said was how you do one thing is how you do everything. And I was like, oh my God, yeah. Like when I get into conflict, I shut down. When things are too hard, I shut down. And it just blew the top off of how I would cope with difficult challenges. And that was only layer one of the mind-blowing things that happened because I recognized this isn't helping me. This isn't serving me. I'm just perpetuating this BS cycle of not getting better. And no wonder why, I have crippling anxiety. Like I shut down, I don't complete things. I feel like a victim and I'm not taking radical accountability for my life. And that was such a game changer. But here's the thing, when I have these conversations with my clients, you and I talk about this all the time, shutting down when I was a child was what kept me safe.
Yeah.
And I am so grateful for that part because I needed that to get through a lot of really difficult stuff. I needed to kind of just hibernate. That was how, as a child, I developed a coping mechanism to get through stuff. And so, as an adult, we can recognize that's becoming maladaptive, right? Like, I have the resources, I'm getting the resources to be able to do things differently. And that part of me, like, I don't really need that anymore. Like, I hold gratitude for that part. Thank you for getting me through it. And now I can handle this. I can handle it without having to shut down and retreat. And so again, it was just absolutely life-changing to recognize that because here's the other thing, as you mentioned, and I forget the quote of who says this, but it wasn't originally Joe Dispenza, but until you make the unconscious conscious, it's going to direct your life and you'll call it fate. So the question I get often is, well, how do I know? Like, how do I know they're blocks, right? It's like being locked in a box and the key's on the outside. How do you even see your own bullshit? That's the value of being reflective, of meditating, of working with a really good coach that can just kind of prompt the right questions because this is not work that is easy to do by yourself. It's possible, it's very possible, but that feedback, and that interaction is really what be helps create that shift. And again, the openness, right? The openness to a different perspective that you wouldn't have otherwise considered is what's going to continue to open those doors for you. So,
Yeah. And it takes time, right? I think that we have become so adapted to instant results. We live in a world that has brilliant technology. We we don't I don't think we give enough credit to the systems and structures we have, but it
Mhm.
also trains us to look for the shortcut and look for the fast. And I know you can say it as much as I can. None of this is fast.
None of
None of
it.
this is fast. And the journey is the destination.
It is. And you guys can steal this phrase all you want. What I tell my clients all the time, you cannot Amazon Prime this. We are so used to, I
Mm,
love Amazon Prime. I know people have opinions, whatever. I love getting my books the next day. I love the expediency and a busy life of that.
mhm.
Personal development, spiritual ascension, growth, growing a business, none of that is fast. It takes consistency, it takes dedication. And, even in the hypnotherapy realm, I have beef with colleagues who promise results in a single session or over the duration of a couple weeks. It's like, that's not how this goes. That's not how
Yeah.
any of this works. It takes us on average 2 months plus to create and solidify a new habit. And even then, those neural pathways that default to our old patterns are still there. So it's not
Mhm.
like I'm going to work out for 8 weeks and suddenly that's a
No.
lifelong pattern. You have to still consistently work at it until it becomes a part of your identity. And that's really, at the um, deeper level of what we're speaking to, it's about creating a new identity because the
It
identity that you
is.
used to have was a default identity. You weren't intentional in creating a life you want. This is about becoming the conscious creator and taking back control and saying, this doesn't serve me. Hey, I like that attribute. I'm a really compassionate person. I like that. I want to keep that. But these other elements of me don't serve me, right?
Yes. And I work with when Angie does the hypnotherapy, this is what's really fun about you and I, is you're getting so deep into the subconscious. I work with more of I guess I call it the ego self, where I'm looking at those neural pathways. And when I'm not asking people, when I'm telling people about themselves, I'm first asking them. So they tell me everything I need to know and I just put it together and make sense of it. But a lot of people get kind of paranoid about that process because they think there's this good and bad, this right and wrong. And to what you just said, there are two sides to the coin, but they all live on the same coin, right? So we either have the unhealthy traits that aren't serving us, those are the ones that aren't serving us, or we have these healthy ones that are really strengths. So
Hmm.
I look at the strength and the struggle. And I always tell people they all exist in the same plane,
Hmm.
but becoming self aware allows you to pick. It allows you to pick. So we're not turning off some beautiful strength you have, but a trigger will activate your struggle,
Hmm.
right? So it's really an interesting dynamic. I think 2020 and COVID were profound shifts for people. And you had that aha moment. I started my business in 2019. I had plenty of triggers. I served small business and they were shutting down. They were literally trying to figure out if they were going to be open anymore. And so I, of course, was triggered. Brand new business owner, doing all that. And fortunately and unfortunately, the lack of small business that I had during that time opened me up to be a bit of an advocate in my own area. And it was exactly where I was supposed to be. I joke that I have a big mouth and God was like, this is how we're going to use it. Um, but it was a really interesting journey and I got to learn a lot about my triggers during that time. Number one, I was really in the public view. And so my name and my face were well known. And even though I tried to be diplomatic in everything that I say, people interpret everything based on their own triggers, most people.
Hmm.
So even if I was diplomatic, people would put me in this bucket or that bucket or wherever. So the first thing I had to learn was how to be okay with people not accepting me,
Hmm.
right? And that was a deep trigger from
Hmm.
childhood. Again, survival,
Yep.
never feeling like I was quite adequate enough. That was a deep trigger. That was the first one I learned. And fortunately, I was around people that helped me see that so I could learn as I went. But I had a really good therapist during that time. If you don't go to therapy, I highly recommend that you find people that are really qualified in more of like what you do, Ange. And this therapist was. And so I was working on my deep childhood stuff at that time. And then 2020 happened. And all these triggers were just popping up everywhere. And she and I would talk about this, and she would really poke at those triggers. Like, why does that get you so fired up? Like, why is this? Why is that? And I was so offended. I'm like, why isn't everybody fired up? Right? I had just all these triggers. And it took time. It took time and it took me being triggered, not knowing if I wanted to continue seeing her, all
Right.
these things. Well, I was listening to a podcast during that time by Jordan Peterson. And I know there are a lot of Jordan Peterson fans out there. Some people love him, some people hate him. I happen to be very intrigued by him. And he did this podcast, and it was an instant trigger for me. He was talking about, I'm not going to say the word because I don't want to get censored on any platforms, but he was talking about boosters of different kinds, right? And the science behind it. And my personal bias towards things got deeply triggered.
Mhm.
And I recognized it and I got instantly upset. And it was the first time that I said, whoa, I know what's happening here. And so what I did is I forced myself to stay and listen.
Yeah.
And I think it was the first moment that I fully recognized, number one, that I was triggered, that I was uncomfortable, and I wanted to shut it off. I wanted to shut down, escape it. And I've had many of these moments, but this one was so profound. And so I stayed in it because if the trigger is there, it
Mhm.
has something to teach you. And in the long run, what I gained from that was a huge sense of compassion for all sides of what was happening,
Mhm.
a huge sense. And
Yes.
then it opened my eyes to what was really happening. Like,
Yeah.
talk about there being some kind of a veil,
Yeah.
right? So you see, and that's a responsibility too,
Hmm.
because the world looks different when you don't look at it from your place of being triggered.
Right. And you kind of, eagle eye view life. You pull yourself up from your 3D experience and begin to see all sides
Yeah.
with a sense of curiosity. And that's something that you and I talk about a ton is like, wow, that's so interesting.
Mm.
Wow, that's so I'm so curious about, their thought process. It's such a different energy versus, oh my gosh, what a terrible person. And, I was, I don't think I told you, maybe I did. I was at a soccer game this weekend, and there was a woman who became ballistic at our coach. Now, her perception was that this person parked too close, almost hit her. My view lens was there was a 7-foot gap between these vehicles. Now, this lady just went off, and I'm thinking, how interesting. What happened to her earlier that day? Because what happened was not, in her lens, was very much real, right? So I'm not going to discount her perception as very real. What the coach and I experienced from a different vantage was a very different perception. And so, sounds like a good guy. We talked, and he's like, I'm not sure what happened to her today, but she wanted to pick a fight. And there was a recognition of there's something else going on there because our triggers are simply just the surface. It's always something deeper. Maybe you don't feel heard. Maybe you feel threatened because you're in an unsafe relationship. There's so many reasons why. And another great analogy is someone cutting you off in traffic, right? Like you're driving down the road and someone comes in and cuts you off, right? The unhealed person could be like, you effing blah, 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 and go off and just get so angry. Like, how dare you do that? How dangerous. Now, from a different lens, right? Like maybe you're thinking how you should have left earlier for work, or you shouldn't have stopped at Starbucks, or whatever you're thinking. But from a different lens, what if that was a mom taking her child to the ER because something horrible just happened?
Right.
You
Yeah.
would you would have a very different experience of that, right?
Yeah.
It's simply having another vantage point. And so when it comes to, I wasn't really intending on going this direction. However, when we look at others, that gives us such a different lens of compassion because people are coming in with the knowledge they have at the time. And if we can understand that in every area, people are simply doing the best they can,
Yeah.
truly with the knowledge they have, it disarms all of us, right? Like that woman, I felt frustrated because the way they were carrying on in front of kids was
Mhm.
frustrating. that's my own perception. That's my own BS, right? My expectations of how a person should be. That's my own filter, you know? However, if we can look at the world and just be more curious, like I wonder what's going on beneath the surface.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
even our parents, we've talked about that, you know, with our parents and how we were raised. It's like, but there's more beneath the surface to why they did what they did. And when we can look beyond that, it not only saves us a lot of grief and anxiety and stress, but
Mm.
it allows us to show up with a deeper compassion and empathy that you just can't have if you're constantly reacting.
No, it is one of the hardest places to get to, I think, for a lot of people. But when you get there, that's true freedom.
Mhm.
You're not the slave to all your triggers,
Yeah.
which is what it all comes back to and why it's so important. So I know that we wanted to approach this subject a little bit in the world of politics. So trigger warning to everybody watching, because you and I, we banter about the political world right now. And again, just so everybody is clear, our stance overall is from a place of curiosity. This is just an interesting time to be alive. It's a very different viewpoint when you're looking at it from an unattached place to a political party, especially to a political party. So Ange, let's just dip our toe into this and see what happens.
All right.
All right.
So, I mean, you're spot on. You know, we are in wild times, and I have these moments throughout the day of just complete gratitude that we are alive right now to see what's happening. It's just the most interesting experience, but it's also shaking people loose of their paradigms. You know, and one of the things that I had seen years ago, and this is a great analogy for the political climate, it was a meme or whatever online. And it was this idea that you put black ants and red ants in a jar together,
Mm,
right? So let's just assume that's red and blue, okay? You
yeah.
put them in a jar together and they don't know any different. They're just chilling out, hanging out, doing ant things. And then suddenly an outside force shakes that. And those little puppies just go at each other and just completely start attacking the other side. And suddenly it becomes this polarity of good and bad, right and wrong,
Mm,
black versus red, you know, or blue versus red, you know, right? When we look at the world. And so the question is, what's shaking humanity to cause this divisiveness? Because you know, my values and beliefs have changed drastically as I've done my own healing, and I don't fall into a this or a that with politics. I don't, because frankly, I think it's, you know, two wings of the same bird. However, and when we look at this, um, there are these things that keep happening that are revving people up, which when you're triggered, okay, your critical faculties shut down. You are not in your thinking brain. You are in complete survival. So the idea that at any point in this, I can try to argue logic with you from my perspective, not going to happen because
mm,
you're going to go into fight flight, right? And that's going to completely trigger you. You're going to dig your heels in the ground harder and fight back even more and becomes this like, you know, duality that we can't escape when we're in this state of seeing only from one perspective. And so, you know, we look at what's happening with a lens of curiosity. And I am a very firm believer. You can call me Pollyanna, I don't care. I think everything is unfolding divinely as it's meant to. I think all the triggers that are coming up are waking people up to like, this isn't the way to be. Because if we look higher level, right, we'll go there. This is a little woo, but it's not. Everything is energy. We are energy. Like Einstein has said, energy cannot be created or destroyed. Everything has energy. So we are all floating around energy that are interconnected. You know, there is this higher conscious order that's driving who we are as these spiritual beings here having a human experience. And yet we're all experiencing this human existence, and there is no disconnect from me, from you, from other people. And so, you know, what we do when we come to Earth is we forget that, you know, we individuate, we forget that we are all of this higher energy. And we, you know, believe that we're separate, which buys into this further belief that there's a good and there's a bad, there's a right and there's a wrong, and it's all just experiential. And I think, COVID was a mass awakening for many people, and that was, kind of my reactivation of remembering. Um, because things were just coming up that I couldn't deny. And I was just like, that's really interesting. Why am I feeling this way? My intuition's picking up. Like, why are these things happening? Um, but it's like there's this rolling ball that you can't stop. This snowball propelling down a hill, you can't stop. And people are waking up in droves because they're beginning to understand there has to be a better way. Like,
Yeah.
whether you want to say that the two-party system no longer works, I don't care. There's got to be a better way where we can come together as people versus, taking sides. Like, how can we? Because I think at the end of the day, so many of our values are similar. People want to be healthy, they want to be happy, they want to feel free, they want to live a good life.
Yeah.
And that's not a political thing, that's a human right. Like, you come to this planet to experience things. And beneath all the BS, those are the
Mm.
foundational things that I think we can all agree on. And if we can't agree on those, then there's something else going on there. Again, deeper triggers that make us kind of believe that that's not what life is about or we're worthy of or whatever. So that's kind of my take, on what's happening. And again, it's through a lens of how interesting. How interesting is all of this? And this is just furthering what needs to happen to allow people to ascend, to allow people to get out of the matrix, as we say.
Yeah. It's it's like a parody. That's the way I see it. I see it all, again, from my own viewpoint now, which is that's almost ridiculous. And then I watch people get fired up about it.
Mhm.
And then I see something over here that's equally as ridiculous. And
Mhm.
I watch people get fired up about it.
Mhm.
And it's very hard to look at either side and say, that's right, that's wrong.
Right.
I think the bigger mission, and this may trigger people, but I'm going to say it, is that it's all just here to trigger us to a point of awakening.
Mhm.
Because if we look at it and we think, hmm, that doesn't make a lot of sense. That seems like a weird parody comedy show.
Mhm.
I think then we start to look at it a little differently. Maybe we don't take it as seriously. We
Right.
see it more as part of the ride and part of the journey because, like you said, we came here to remember. We
Mhm.
came here to embody the experience around us,
Mhm.
and we are getting it.
Yeah.
We are getting it. And if you think back, I know I'm a little bit older than you. We don't have to talk about it, but I'm a little bit older. But I remember Ronald Reagan being president. And I remember George Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton, some of these presidents before, and everything just seemed normal. Everything was just normal. Life was life.
Mhm.
My children, who are 19 and 22, they're new voters. And they're seeing this and they're going, what? What do
Right.
I do?
This is our option. This is what we have. Yeah.
Right. And they're getting that point where it's been an interesting thing to watch as a parent because again, their journey is their journey. So I just stand back and I especially can watch my younger son just trying to navigate it. He's got the best intentions and he's such a pure heart. And he really is just trying to navigate the information and then he's like, wow, did that just happen? Is
Mhm.
is this really happening? And all I can say is, isn't that ridiculous? That's the only thing I can say.
Yeah.
He's going to have to navigate this on his own. But it is such an interesting time to be alive.
Yeah.
And how lucky are we to be able to be here for part of it?
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm going to venture to say the next few months are going to be very interesting.
Yeah, they absolutely will. And here's the thing, as you said, like things are becoming so ridiculous, it's making people wake up. And what a great thing. What a great thing that this parody is playing out. The world is a stage, and we're all here to be like, wow, like they're trying that now too, huh? Or that's happening. Huh. Curious. And not that we're going to throw tinfoil hats on and say everything is a conspiracy, but it makes you just begin to look at things through a lens of there's probably more information here. There's
Yeah.
what's beneath the surface of what's being presented, and what is the intention, right? Because you see an event happen, and then you see, these sides of the political parties, whatever it is, like get really, really fired up. How much more energy would we have if we didn't focus it there? To
Right.
me, it's like this is such a big distraction to the power that we really have as creative beings. I mean, if we didn't get caught up in all these things that were distractions and even social media, right? Like,
Mhm.
it's you look at the Roman Empire when people used to go and watch the Colosseum, it's like it's the ultimate distraction. You're taking the brain power of people. And we have that modern day football games and social media and our politics and our other organizations. And it's not to say we can't enjoy those experiences, but the problem is that that's the depth at which only some people will get to. And then, my background is hospice. So if any of you know me, I was a hospice nurse for many years. I have a very different perspective on life. I saw so many people at end of life regret not doing more,
Mhm.
not taking chances on themselves, not going after their dreams, not doing something bigger with deeper meaning, really leaving an impact on this planet. And not everybody needs to be a massive change maker out there. You could be the gas station attendant and be positively impacting thousands of people by your energy, by the way you conduct yourself. You don't have to be reaching an audience of millions on a podcast. So, but I would see people come to end of life just so sad they didn't take a chance. They didn't trust themselves enough, or they were so distracted by everything else going on that that's what this is about, living this experience so fully that you recognize anything is really possible, right? Once you remove those elements of the subconscious that no longer serve you, that have been those protective parts, um, and neutralize them, right? They're not bad, but we want to neutralize them and garner that superpower they provide. My biggest traumas are also the biggest reasons I have so many awesome skill sets and so many really big views, on a lot of stuff. And it's alchemizing, we're alchemizing the trauma to turn it into triumph. And if we're not doing the work, we're not looking at the triggers, we're not just being curious and questioning everything, And again, it's not with the lens of conspiracy, but questioning our own things. Like, why do I feel triggered that this happened?
Mhm.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember being little and not feeling heard. Hmm.
Mhm.
Interesting. Okay. And our feelings, our thoughts are not real. Like that's the other thing is we
Right.
get so attached. They're not. They're perceptions, they're programs playing out. And we choose. That is the biggest thing. I mean, if you can take away anything from this episode, choice. We have choice in every single thing we do. And I see people that are stuck in victimhood who feel like they don't have other options. And I was that person for a long time. I didn't realize that I was keeping myself perpetually stuck. We have a choice. You're in an unhappy relationship, figure out how to get out of it. You're in a job you hate. There are more. One of the things I heard a lot of times was, oh, the golden handcuffs. Like, I can't leave my benefits. There are other jobs with other benefits. Like, you can figure it out if you want it enough, but complaining about it every day to people around you is not going to change your reality. Like, you have the power to choose. And it brings up, if you haven't read the book by Viktor Frankl, A Man's Search for Meaning, he was somebody who was a person. I'm not even going to say a victim because he wouldn't see himself that way. He was a person who was in the concentration camps. And that was the big takeaway was like, you can take everything from me except my right to choose.
Yes.
It doesn't say it quite like that, but in every situation, we have the power to choose how we show up, how we interpret things, how we feel, how we respond, everything. And it's our responsibility to take back that control and choose differently.
Mhm. Yeah, that's the tough medicine. And that is the level of game that we aim for.
Mhm.
Those really hard triggers have a lot to teach us.
Mhm.
But when you get through it, what lies on the other side is a deeper meaning of life. And I think about that all the time. You know, when that day comes, if I have the opportunity to reflect on my own life, I want to reflect and just say, thank God I had all those moments. Thank
Yeah.
God I had the choices. They're not easy. So I don't want people to think that number one, this is easy work. There is no quick fix, right? All we can do is take the next step.
Mhm.
And that is to think about what's happening, right? So in those moments, what is happening? And then the next step beyond that is to change.
Mhm.
Change your reaction, change your thought. But it is a one thing after another type thing. It's not a all at once.
Correct.
Yeah.
I mean, you're spot on, and it really is, and this could be a whole nother episode, is radical responsibility,
Mm,
unrelenting responsibility that in every single situation, we are given the right to choose, right? Like we have free will as humans. Like
mhm.
we can do whatever we want. Truly. I mean, you could, some of it's illegal, but you can do whatever you want. Like no one's going to stop you. People
Yeah.
might, but you could. But it's about looking at your life and taking radical responsibility because every single thing you have in your life is a reflection of what's internal, your home, the amount of money you make, the real quality of relationships you have. And some people would be, are challenge that and say, well, I didn't manifest this abuse. However, on a soul level, there may
Mhm.
be something there. On a childhood level, if that's what you grew up knowing, that feels safer to you than having a healthy relationship because to that beautiful little mind, you survived that, and that's a situation you know how to survive. You've not yet survived being in a healthy relationship. And while consciously you and I can be like, well, that's ridiculous, that's
Mhm.
not what's running the show. The subconscious is always running the show. So it's about challenging all of that and then saying, like, is it ultimately true that this is how everything always is, right? Because again, our shades of perception want to know how it is. That's an ego construct. Like, how is it? We want to figure it out. It
Mhm.
doesn't have to be how it's always been, And again, we can talk about the deeper how to reprogram that because there are things you can do to kind of help that process. But the first thing is just recognition. So if anything that you can take away from this episode today, um, just be curious. Just be
Yeah.
curious about your triggers. Your kids, do something that pisses you off. Be curious. What is it? Is it your desire for control? Because they're overwhelming? Been there. Like, that's who I used to be. And there's elements of that still exist for me. Control, feeling like I need to have that safety. But it's like, but what's the deeper meaning behind the trigger? So just start getting curious. And again, as you said earlier, there's no shame in this. This is not a shame game. This isn't a blame game. This isn't a fault in your character whatsoever. This is the human experience.
Yeah. It's the human experience. And the last thing, just when you're being curious, one thing that is really helpful for me, and you might have the scientific reason behind it, but I think when those moments happen, if I actually say, what is it about this bothering me? What
Mhm.
is it about this that's bothering me? Ask out loud, write it down, let that message come through.
Mhm.
Um, but recognizing it, either writing it or saying it
Mhm.
is pretty powerful. So
Yeah.
that would be my hint for my hack, maybe for getting through it.
Yeah, and that's called the pattern interrupt. So, anytime you stop in the middle of some kind of thing, it's a pattern interrupt. So your brain is firing, firing, firing. This one thought way, this one, highway of information is rolling. The second you stop it, that stops the brain from firing off those actions that would usually snowball into a bigger problem for you. You kind of like, oh, I recognize that. Okay, what about this is making me feel angered? So I mean, that's something I teach all of my clients the first session, the pattern interrupt, anything you can do to begin to just stop that because it's, again, an automatic habit. You're not intentionally trying to be triggered. It's just firing off because something happened that created that response. It's like Pavlov's dog. If you don't know that story, I won't get into it now, but it's, an automatic response the brain has. So begin to just be curious, pattern interrupt it and reflect on it. And, as questions come up or topics that you want to dive in more, please, drop us a message, send us an email because we could talk all day about all these things. And we really want to know what's important to you with where you're at and how we can best serve you. So thank you for taking time to listen to this today. And we look forward to chatting again. See
Yeah. See you next time.
you next time.